On the China-India piece, I was speaking to an Indian diplomat recently, and I'd asked him about this process of normalization since the October meeting in Kazan. And I asked him, well, what's the process? Where are we at this stage of normalization? And he smiled beatifically and told me, we've been normalizing our relationship with China for the past 2,000 years.
The threshold of catalytic events around us at every level, and prime amongst them right now is the global order, the economic structures that have upheld the last 80, 100 years. All of it is up for discussion, for reorientation, for reinvention. Everybody is scrambling, for their sort of safety meters because the order of the world is changing literally by the minute. I met somebody who's an advisor to big corporates on how to invest in countries across the world, and he said every time he sends a memo, 15 minutes later, it's irrelevant. So it is that level of churn that we're living in. Sitting at the heart of it is a disruptive, some would say visionary, some would say mad king, some would say the US president. So Donald Trump sits at the heart of this churning world, and he has, as he said, literally pulled the carpet from under the order that everyone had accepted as immutable. There are many who support him, many who, like The Economist said, it's the most profoundly unwarranted and disruptive, economically disastrous decision-making that has happened in the history of America. Its ripple effects spread out across China, Europe, the entire world, Vietnam, Cambodia, and India itself. Many see it as a gigantic opportunity for a new multi-ordered world. To decode all of that, we have someone absolutely fantastic with us here. Manoj Kewalramani is unilaterally recommended by everybody across the spectrum as the voice of China to be watched out for, voice on China. Sorry, you're going to get arrested, Manoj. Voice on China to be watched out for. He's a fellow of China Studies at Takshila Institution. He writes a daily newspaper analyzing what China is saying about itself. And as I said, he's been highly recommended by everybody from within government to his peers in academia and think tanks. And we're very proud to have him here today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Manoj Kewalramani. Manoj, as I said, it's great to have you here, so thank you for coming. I just wanted to dive into two aspects of this. As I said, first of all, it is so polarizing. President Trump obviously has large supporters who, for all the disruption it's creating in their personal lives, still support him. Now, the mystifying aspect of that is that he inherited an economy which was really doing well by all standards. Inflation was down, unemployment was low, the stock markets were doing well. So in that scenario, why is it that his rhetoric took such deep hold? And of course, there's the binary opposite where people just think he's the most disruptive madman of the century. So how would you read this from both sides of the coin?
Right. Thank you so much, Roma. Thank you so much, everyone at Lucid Lines. And thank you so much, everyone, for taking time out of your evening to be here. When you look at mythology and religion, there is this sense of manifest destiny, great men, great characters come and they shape the world. And anytime we think of the great man theory, we tend to think of, particularly when you think of it from a religious perspective, you think of it as something ordained towards goodness. The great man makes changes for goodness. Great man theory, however, doesn't say that, right? You can be agents of chaos, but you can still be great. In the process of doing that, you might unlock some changes that might be fundamentally needed. I think Trump's somewhere there. He's an agent of chaos, but he's also got the nub of a particular problem that the United States in particular, but the world in general is also facing. While inflation was down, the people in the United States didn't feel that, right? It wasn't necessarily translating into the price of milk, the price of eggs, your daily living. And it still isn't today. And that's also why you see his poll numbers falling. And I think that was the big piece that he got hold of. Of course, there were multiple factors. Nothing in an election is monocausal. So there were multiple factors that got him to where he is right now. Now, why is it that he still commands that support? Well, part of it is because when leaders are elected with a popular mandate, and in the United States with an electoral college mandate, just like in India when Prime Minister Modi was elected first, there were policies that the Prime Minister in India also took on, which were not necessarily seen as sound, which were not necessarily seen as rooted in traditional advice. But the public at large gave him the leeway because there was a sense that he's trying to do something. Let's see where it goes. And I think Trump understands that. He knows that he has a certain leeway, and therefore he's trying to shake the order to try and achieve what he wants to achieve. And what he wants to achieve is essentially rebalance the United States' relationship with the world. I think his politics is rooted in a deep sense of grievance, which has resonated across America, but for him personally, that the United States in some way has been taken for a ride. Now, you may disagree with that, I may disagree with that, data may disagree with that, but emotions don't care about data, right? And public mandate is based on predominantly emotions. Nobody looks at charts and votes. So I think that sense of grievance, which populists around the world, but him in particular, have harnessed, is about how do you reshape the American economy and its relationship with the world in that sense.
So, what I would like to understand is that even in the short term, everything that he's doing will actually raise prices for his consumers. It's not that factories are going to move to America that fast. In terms of materials, in terms of food, in terms of rare minerals, China controls 62%. It controls 91% of refining of these, which underpins all the technological prowess even of America. That even to pivot is going to be deeply disruptive for his own society. So, and also that manufacturing jobs, which he wants to bring back to India, to America, the issue is that manufacturing is not even creating jobs, because there's automation. So what is the economic structure that he's foreseeing and which the society is buying into?
Yeah, I think what he's foreseeing is and populists do this around the world, right? History is their battleground, so they will play with the idea of a golden age, which Trump talked about in his inauguration address also. The idea is that he's imagining an economy of the 19th and 20th century, right? He's imagining an industrial age economy. And like the promo on Synapse showed, right, we're not in the industrial age economy. The industrial age economy feels comfortable, right? And that has a lot to do with the inability of America, but not just America, around the world, to adapt to changes in technology and to be able to imagine a future economy. So what he's imagining is essentially, a manufacturing-based economy. Marco Rubio, in his confirmation hearing, said something to the effect of, over a period of time, within the next few years, China will build everything that we are reliant on fundamentally, and we can't have that, right? So there is a security element, there is a strategic competition element to this piece. And Trump is not unique to that, right? Biden before him did something very similar, although not so disruptive. He was trying to sort of thread the needle. Trump is basically taking a sledgehammer to everything because he feels that threading the needle is not going to work. And the objective is to create an economy where America makes things. Because America today is predominantly a financialized and service-based economy. It's not really a manufacturing economy. The objective is to bring back some manufacturing. Now, are you going to bring back making shoes, making shirts? Not really, and I don't think that's necessarily what he wants. What he wants is to bring back certain aspects of high-tech manufacturing, which are then located in America. Biden's policy was that those aspects of high-tech manufacturing are not just located in America, but they're also with friends and allies and sort of trusted partners, right? So that you can firewall yourself from Chinese coercion. Trump's objective is far more autarkic. He wants to look at America as sort of this bastion of manufacturing, and that's the sort of sense of golden age, right? I think in some ways he'll look at the 1940s America, which was the global manufacturing leader, and say, hey, look, that was a good time. We were doing really well. And the instrument of his choice predominantly has been tariffs. he's in this term, before this term also, he's talked a lot about McKinley, President McKinley, who famously imposed tremendous tariffs in the late 1800s and then withdrew them and then realized his folly. I think Trump has gone through that arc that McKinley went for over a period of years within a couple of days or a week. But I think that's what his objective is, right? He wants to bring this back.
So we'll come back to India. I just want to open up different pockets of the world. So, if we shift to China, one, it's just fascinating statistics. They were only 6% of global manufacturing in 2000. And in just 25 years, they are now 33% of global manufacturing. And they're just 13% of global consumption. So that is a crazily asymmetrical structure. But there's a lot of talk that the US and President Trump, by doing this, has actually, one, elevated China. It was still seen as the second global power, but he's now put them exactly on the same platform. So one, has that boomeranged. Secondly, that, even the US's sort of synaptic connection with China is fairly small. It's not that they can really disrupt China. China's been building its relationships with everybody else. So how do you see the China position in this trade war? And secondly, how is China themselves perceiving it?
Yeah, I think that this sense of whether Trump has elevated China to a peer competitor, I think that happened way before Trump. That happened in the American imagination. That started happening in 2010 when China took over Japan as the second largest economy. It started happening when Barack Obama announced the pivot to Asia. And then sort of there's been a secular change in that. Now, obviously, Obama could not enforce the pivot to Asia because of issues in the Middle East. But if you see thereafter, China has been a key part of US domestic politics, and there's no upside in American domestic politics to being soft on China, which just tells you that there's a sense. The Biden administration had defined China as a pacing competitor, as a pacing challenge. So I don't think Trump's necessarily elevated China. What he's done is essentially he's deployed a certain kind of strategy, and I think it's a holistic strategy. It's not just tariffs. And despite all the confusion, I think there is a strategy there. I think tariffs and economic restriction, restraining China's ability to be able to produce and manufacture is key to weakening the Chinese economy. Like you said, the Chinese are not really consuming as much, and therefore lots of products very cheaply are being dumped across the world. If the world becomes expensive for Chinese products, well, who's going to consume? And if nobody's going to consume, the Chinese will have to consume. If the Chinese don't consume, there's lots of wasted output, and you'll have to cut output. When you cut output, you cut jobs. When you cut jobs, you end up with social instability. And that's what the Communist Party of China fears the most. So that's your sort of long arc of dominoes that could fall. There's also a strategy from a security perspective. I think the Trump administration, for all the talk about Trump being transactional and will give away Taiwan, will give away this, I think Trump has been extremely hawkish on China. His administration has been, even in this term, has been worse from a Chinese perspective than Trump 1.0. Increasingly, you see that sense within China. And therefore, you will see Beijing wanting to bargain not just about tariffs, but also about Taiwan. So I think there's a holistic strategy. It's incoherent because there are different elements within the administration, different members of this coalition. Some are folks who look at the United States, who want the United States to regain its sense of preponderance as a global superpower. Some are prioritizers who want to see the United States rebalance away from European commitments towards some bit of Asia. Some are the Wall Street guys who want to see continued unimpeded trade and business because it's good for capital. Some are folks who want to bring back this manufacturing and who want to cut deals, folks like Elon Musk. And then there are the pure ideologues, right, who believe that, yes, the United States should be a global power, but who also believe that the US has a new set of values. Some of that is isolationism. About 60% of Americans, when you ask them today, should the US have a preponderant role in the world, they'll say, nope, let's focus internally. But some other folks are saying, well, do you want the US or the Chinese values to rule the world? There's no American values, but American values redefined, right? Freedom of speech of the kind that we want, not the kind that the so-called liberals want. So there is this mix of coalition with the US, which leads to tremendous incoherence in how policy plays out. But there is a strategy.
So, that's a fascinating sort of lay of the land. But if you just deepen that focus then on China, you said that there is anxiety, there is posturing that they're not going to back down. Just, I think today, President Trump claimed that they were having talks, but China said there's no talks going on. So, I mean, like I said, you've been watching it on a daily basis. You know the internal chatter in China. So, one, how resilient really are they? Will they be able to withstand this assault? And secondly, is there deep anxiety or is there not? And are these talks on or are they not?
So are these talks on or not? I think my sense is they're not. As strange as it may seem, I tend to believe the Chinese version of this much more than the American version. I think that's much more trustworthy in this sense, because it's much more coherent. I think there is deep anxiety within China. On the surface, there will always be tremendous confidence. Like Shoma said, I do a daily newsletter on China, which I read the Chinese Communist Party's mouthpiece, People's Daily. And the day after these tariffs were imposed, the People's Daily had an editorial, which signifies the sort of central line of the party. And the quote from that was like, "This is going to be difficult, but the sky will not fall." Now, that's very uncharacteristic, right? It's projecting confidence, but it's saying that, look, this is going to be rough. Time to tighten belts. Yeah, that it's going to be rough. And you don't usually see that sort of language. So I think there is deep anxiety. The anxiety is around the impact on, so if I just look at China's foreign trade, right, about 37% of Chinese GDP is comprised of foreign trade. Over the last few years, foreign trade has been far more important. I mean, if you go back 15 years, 20 years ago, it was about 65%. So it's down, but as a cumulative, it's still quite large. About 18 to 19% of Chinese GDP is comprised of exports. So it's a substantive industry, right? Now, you're going to see stress across the eastern prosperous belt, places like Zhejiang, Yiwu, Jiangsu, Guangzhou, where you have foreign trade companies, right? So you're going to see stress there. And the Chinese Communist Party is concerned about that. You're going to see layoffs. And they're concerned about that because that, like I said, can lead to protests. Protests can lead to social stability issues for the Communist Party. That, to me, is the primary concern. The secondary concern is what sort of deals are other countries going to be cutting with the United States? And what does that do to Chinese exports through other countries, right? So that's another big concern. Can you sustain this level of trade? There are also opportunities. The opportunities are, well, Trump has alienated the Europeans. There's a sense of loss of credibility of the United States. And that's an opportunity. Can you capitalize on that by trying to tell other countries, do you really want to trust the United States in the long term? Do you really want to alienate us by blocking our investments, our goods? Why don't you accept some of our goods and things like that? So to me, that's the sort of primary concern. What the party has done is three things. First, it has sought to project the sense of confidence among the people. Second, it's sought to support foreign trade entities through some degree of government subsidies, but also trying to see if you can ease customs and other issues. So it reduce transaction costs so that the exporters can start to shift their businesses to other places. The challenge is who's going to consume. And the third thing is to try and reach out to the US administration, not necessarily escalate in the sense that Trump has escalated, but offer some olive branches. Fundamentally, what they're hoping for is that their ability to withstand the pain will be they'll be able to withstand the pain for far longer, they're buying time, than the United States can. And they see Trump's two moves, the 90-day reprieve to other countries and the exemptions to certain Chinese technology goods, as signs that he's buckling.
So, and when you said that it has that capacity to last this siege more than US, is it because it's an autocratic government and US is a democracy where people can speak? Or is it because they're economically stronger?
No, I think there is economic strength. I think the autocracy, as much as I don't like autocracies, the autocracy helps in such emergencies because you can sort of block the flow of information, you can curtail chains of protests and things like that. But I think that predominantly what's important is that China does have economic strength, right? It is genuinely an innovating country. It's a country with tremendous foreign exchange reserves. It's a country with tremendous access to capital. The US has still not been able to block Chinese capital flows. It's a country which the world is dependent on for manufacturing, and they know that. So there are levers that they can pull. So I think that their game is that over a period of 6 to 8 months, yes, we will suffer, but we can withstand. And of course, if you stoke nationalism, as we know very well in this country also, if you stoke nationalism, people will be willing to let go of, people will be willing to bear some more pain. And that's what their hope is, right? That you can do that while the US consumer, will not necessarily be able to bear that pain. And already, I think when you see Trump's ratings falling, they see that as a positive opportunity for them.
Right. So again, I want to keep deepening these, but just to open up the India facet of this now. One, Jay Shankar has said it's a great opportunity for India, that this could become the China plus one. A lot of all these disrupted supply chains could come to India. But even, this thing is, like you said, it's been bubbling for a long while, but it hasn't really come to India. So one, what is the problem here? Number two is that there's this idea that China may be reaching out to India, and this could actually change the China-India equation. He's talked about the dragon and the elephant dancing, tangoing together, and that we might actually have more integration with them now. How do you see the Indian establishment responding to, is that a possibility? And you being a China watcher, do you think it's a good thing to do?
I'll deal with the China-India piece first and then come to the External Affairs Minister's comment. On the China-India piece, I was speaking to an Indian diplomat recently, and I'd asked him about this process of normalization since the October meeting in Kazan. And I asked him, well, what's the process? Where are we at this stage of normalization? And he smiled beatifically and told me, we've been normalizing our relationship with China for the past 2,000 years. so I think that, I'd love to claim that line, but I think that there is an overestimation in our public discourse in what we can achieve with China. Just if you look at since October 2024, which is when the Prime Minister and Xi Jinping met in Kazan, we're still to see direct flights come back. I just read today that the Ministry of External Affairs has put out the Kailash Mansarovar Yatra applications. That's the first thing that we have achieved in 6+ months of conversation, substantively. And these are really low-hanging fruits. So I think expecting too much too soon is something that I wouldn't do. I also think at the same time, you're seeing China systematically take steps to impede manufacturing growth in India. Whether it is for Foxconn, whether it is for other tech companies, whether it is German companies selling tunnel boring machines in India, they have systematically sought to impede some of these elements which can support Indian manufacturing. And even today, even yesterday, in fact, there was a story from the rest of the world which talked about how China is systematically doing this. So I think they see India as a potential manufacturing competitor. And therefore, they are attempting to impede. So I don't think that that piece is going to change. What's changed in the last year and a bit is that India has become a little bit more open to Chinese investments. Right? Our trade has continued unimpeded despite the tensions of the last 5 years. We have a massive
trade deficit.
Yeah, and that has continued unimpeded. I think we tend to worry about a trade deficit far more than we should. I'm okay if I can get cheap Chinese-built technology products in the hands of Indians who can then do tremendous work and enhance their productivity, and therefore India can become richer. I don't see that's a problem. I think on certain technologies we need to be careful, but again, that's a different discussion. I think what we've seen in the last year or so is that we've become open to some Chinese investments, but the assumption that just because India, even if tomorrow, says, okay, the door is open, Chinese investors, please come to India and invest wherever you want. We assume that the Chinese will come and invest because we are this big market. I think that's not going to happen. It didn't happen in the past, even before the restrictions came in April 2020, Press Note 3, which restricted investments. It won't happen again, particularly now after the Chinese investors in India have seen that when tensions rise, suddenly there will be ED cases, suddenly there will be money laundering cases and all that, right? So they are wary. So to me, therefore, the integration, I'm very, very skeptical of it. Now, to the External Affairs Minister's comment about China plus one and investors coming here, like you said, it's not really happened. And that has a lot to do with where Chinese manufacturers feel comfortable, firstly, relocating. And Vietnam, Cambodia are culturally similar, have tremendous government support, which allows Chinese manufacturers to shift their bases. In some cases, some companies have come to India, but even the Western companies that have come to India, their concern has predominantly been around access to land, access to energy, access to water, so basic factor market reforms, ease of getting government clearances. So again, these are not new problems. We still continue to deal with these problems. Also, it's not just that, it's also access to capital, access to port connectivity, inland connectivity. For anybody who's been to China, inland connectivity to ports is fantastic. If you go to Vietnam, the government has invested in that. If you go to other countries, Chinese companies have invested to build roads and port connectivity. I think those are the fundamental things that we need to address. And if we do that, that's a benefit. Also, I think we need to lower our tariffs. So in that sense, there's a silver lining in Trump's madness on tariffs, is that if he can get India to lower its tariffs, that would be great. Because if you lower tariffs, you get cheaper components for manufactured products, and you can export better. So I think that sort of a chain is what we need to build. I mean, the last point that I will make in this, and we talked about this beforehand, where I was telling you that I'm really happy that Trump has done some of these things for all his disruption, which are problematic. For the first time, I'm hearing a conversation on tariffs as taxes. And unfortunately, in India, we don't have that conversation. High tariffs on certain products, which are high quality, are taxes on your and my consumption. I'd not like to pay them, right? We think of them from the state's perspective, from a jobs perspective, that's important, but we don't think of them from the consumer's perspective, and I think that's an important perspective.
But in all these things that you said, are you sort of in a way advocating the pain path that US has already walked, and like you're saying that you lower tariffs, you bring in cheap goods, it's good for your economy and your consumers, but then you kind of hit a national wall where your own infrastructure starts to crumble, so there's consumption, but there isn't infrastructure or there isn't jobs. So one, that do you think that maybe what this time is a challenge for everybody to think completely new, And to that, I again want to come back to your understanding and knowledge of China. Thomas Friedman, who's a great China watcher as well, he's been writing columns that he's gone there and he's trying to wake up the world, saying that the COVID years was a massive blind spot for everyone. And while everyone was, enjoying the sparrows and the nature and being locked inside the house, China was taking its game somewhere else. And they have huge dark factories, their automated production, AI, everything has gone like through the roof, So technology really is that new driving force, which is changing, to Synapse again, and to make a plug for Synapse, do come for it, is that it is deep societal change, it's not just technology. So within China, first give us an understanding that if it has created these gigantic automated dark factories where you don't even need to put on the light because it's just machines producing, how is its inner economy sustaining itself, Its consumption is already low. So they've been saying that they want to boost domestic consumption. So one, how is China structuring its economy? Number two is that, is it strategically right for India to actually open some doors with China and not have only America as its ally, and that there is this whole reordering going on? What can the shape of that take?
Yeah. So on the idea of China restructuring its economy, particularly towards consumption, I've been hearing this since I had a head full of hair, and it's not really happened.
Not 2,000 years ago.
Not 2,000 years ago. But yeah, I don't think it's happened, and it's not fundamentally happening because partly there are cultural reasons. People don't necessarily consume as much in terms of their income. Secondly, there is obviously economic weakness, right? You consume when you feel that you have certainty of income and your wealth has continued to grow. Over the last 5 years in China, because of the property market crackdown, which is done by the government and for very sound reasons, I agree with them when they're doing that, individual wealth, which has been in property, household wealth, has started to stagnate and decline. My investments were in property, the property values are falling, plus there is this COVID disruption, there is a technology disruption. I'm not necessarily sure about my job, so do I necessarily want to take that extra holiday? Do I want to consume so much more? Do I want to take on more debt? Already Chinese household debt to ratios are at around 100-110% of income. So they're already quite high, right? And they are not likely to spend much more. And that's a challenge for the government, right? It needs to do demand-side stimulus by providing some degree of cash vouchers, something like that, where people can spend. But ideologically, the government is against that because Xi Jinping thinks that is laziness and welfareism, which he doesn't want to do. He rather wants to raise the incomes of the people who are poorer in the rural areas and make sure that they consume. But that's going to take a long time. So that reordering is a long, long way away. Another fundamental process is that in the Chinese economy, a lot of it is top-down control, but a lot of it has also tremendous bottom innovation, which is carried out by local governments. Local governments are funded by the central government. So about 85% of the Chinese government expenditure is by local governments. So the ability of those guys to transfer that liquidity to the consumer doesn't take place, right? What they do is they invest in production. And they hope that people are on jobs and therefore people will consume. So that's the restructuring.
So if I cut that short, is China a happy society or not?
I think they're a happy society. I think they're a society which is sort of at a point where individuals are questioning, are their lives better off than their parents? And that's not a good place. I don't by any means want to say that the Chinese economy is going to collapse. It's very resilient, it's not going to collapse. But there are these stressors, right? Because the moment you start seeing whether your life is better than your parents and your grandparents, that's becoming a challenge. Then grandparents, most certainly. When I was in China, I heard tremendous number of stories of people telling me about how somebody in their family died of starvation in the late 70s. And today they were well off. But that's now becoming history, right? You're seeing a more recent time where your lives are not necessarily as better than your parents. And that's a challenge.
So I'm going to ask you to comment on the second part of my question, but just to ask this, but China does have very deep relations with the EU. It has deep relations with the Middle East, economic relations. And I'm increasingly hearing that even America, it's ironic, Nixon came to meet Mao just barely 50 years ago or 60 years ago and said, that they were going to bring this impoverished, isolated country into the web of the US to drive a wedge against Russia. And American foreign policy always seems to blow up in its face, because now it's going to ask for knowledge transfer from China back to the US. And in India also, there's this talk now that you want a knowledge transfer and you want investments here. Europe is plateaued. The Middle East is, it's newly ambitious, but China is its economic center. So coming back to my first question, that is China really, do you see it rise as something even stronger than the US in this new world?
I wouldn't bet against the United States despite all its follies.
Because of its military strength or because
I think militarily the United States will remain the preponderant power for time to come. There are disruptive technologies such as, say, the hypersonic missile which the Chinese have developed, which will close the gap. But I think militarily, just look at the number of American bases around the world. It's, and China has no base unless you count the Ream base in Cambodia. So that's a big part of power play. But also from a sense of economic dynamism, and the ability to harness new technologies, I wouldn't bet against the United States. Even today, the US spends just short of 4% of its GDP on R&D. China, despite tremendous effort today, spends about 2.65%. It's substantive, far more than India. India spends about 0.6, 0.7%. But the US still today is a place where people go for innovation, right? So I wouldn't bet against the United States, right? Secondly, just the idea of an open society that can continue to potentially attract people is far more attractive, it's far more dynamic than necessarily China.
Why I'm stressing on that is because we don't have time to unravel all of American domestic politics right now, but it's also shutting its borders.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. In many ways, President Trump is not just creating economic disorder, or new order. He is changing the sense of American exceptionalism, that this is the land of milk and honey. It's a place where everyone can go and prosper. That national myth itself is being broken, so the two things are going side by side. Whereas China, on the other hand, is trying to be the benefactor of many economies.
But how many people are going to China?
Right.
So if today I was to ask this crowd of very erudite people, if your child is going to study abroad, is he or she going to China? Or are you thinking of the United States, Australia, the UK? The Western ecosystem still has that attraction, right? And it's still cutting edge. Yes, Trump is kneecapping the American economy and the idea of United States as exceptionalism. But that's an internal battle that the United States needs to fight. My bet is that at a certain point of time, however the self-perception of the US changes, it will still remain probably the most dynamic place in the world from a technology and economic perspective.
So to come back to India, what is the opportunity here? Is it just a kind of national rhetoric that's going on right now? Because it's not just the government who's saying it, even socially you hear it. There are a lot of entrepreneurs who are very excited about in the YPO network. I've been kind of having arguments with them and they say, no, you don't understand, this is a great opportunity for India. They're really backing what President Trump is doing. What do you see that to be? Is this national rhetoric or is there real opportunity here?
No, I think there is real opportunity. And I don't think that opportunity lies, part of that opportunity lies in how we deal with the United States and how we balance the relationship with China. Look, India's it's not in India's interest to have an adversarial relationship with China, but that's not only our choice, that's also the Chinese choice. So our objective should be, as has been for the longest time, to try and swing between the US and China, right? Perhaps swing far more closer to the United States, which is what we've been doing. In the process, attract investment into India. Now, to do that, as much as
But I think Kissinger famously said that America's always been worse for its friends than its enemies also.
That's why what the relationship that we've chosen with the United States is a non-alliance friends with benefits relationship. Those can work out better. But I think that's what will work out better, right? The US is worse to its allies than it's to its... I think from an Indian point of view, the US today, even under Trump, looks at India, his primary concern with allies is burden sharing, that you're not doing your fair share. He doesn't have that concern with India, because India is not somebody
it's not a
demanding.
vassal
It's not an ally.
state.
Right,
yeah.
it's not an ally. So our goal is to try and attract as much investment as we can, to try and extract and link as much technology growth that we can, try and see if we can build supply chains with the United States without necessarily alienating the Chinese. To me, a dollar coming from everywhere is good. Right, so I'm happy to accept Chinese investments also. I'm happy to have a relationship with China where even though we are fighting on the border once in a while, we have $800 billion of Chinese investment in India. I'd be very happy with that. That creates its own sense of stability. So to me, our goal is continue to put our head down, make sure that we get our domestic economic policies right, we get our politics right, which is a whole another ballgame, while we continue to maintain these relationships. It sounds very easy, it's obviously very complex to do, but to me, the bigger piece of that is the domestic piece.
So I just, before we run out of time, just want to focus on technology. We were chatting earlier that one sees this actually a hugely disruptive time, that you're trying to bring old sort of band-aids to a new wound, that all our societies across the board, and that includes India and everywhere, China itself is facing this. And I asked you this question, that how they're dealing with such automated factories, such a large population, how? So similarly, what is your thinking on this? Because you're also a big technology watcher. Are you hearing any new shoots, ideas of how economies need to reorient themselves to place technology as the big disruptor and to understand that manufacturing is not going to solve it, and neither is services, because AI might replace services as well. So what's the new thinking on this?
Yeah, so that's the challenge, right? I don't think there's been clear adaptability by anybody, because again, and it's really difficult. Technology is changing at such a rapid pace. 6-8 months ago, we had ChatGPT, then we had DeepSeek, and everything changes a month later, right? So it's difficult to adapt to that. I think what governments can do right now is largely get out of the way, right? Let technology grow while placing certain barriers from an ethical point of view in terms of the impact on humanity. Complicated subject which I can't get into, but the idea is that governments need to get out of the way of innovation by and large, allow innovation to take place. Where you identify harms of innovation, that's where policy should intervene, and let that reshape economies. On your question of how China is dealing with it, look, China is an aging country. Robotics and AI is useful to deal with some of the manpower gap that will come, but even today, its factories are not necessarily entirely automated. China still employs about 180 million people in the export sector alone. So factories.
20% of it.
Yeah, so it's a tremendous employment that still takes place. Yes, automation is happening, but it's not happening at the pace that we're imagining that it's happening, right? And I think the government is making sure that people remain on payrolls in China, which is obviously bleeding government coffers to some degree. I think fundamentally, what we all need to do, and that's just not for people like me, but that's for actually industry, who actually do the work, who actually deal with technology, to try and figure out how you can imagine jobs of the future. People like me are actually most threatened, right? When you see AI replacing deep thinking research and things like that. I think we need to think of how we will adapt to that future. One piece of that would be, how do we redefine productivity? I no longer take 50 days to write a paper. It's come down to about 25 days, right? And just because I'm able to access so much information. So I think that productivity gain is what we should focus on across industries. There will be disruption. Education is a place where we must invest, and education not of the analog era, but of this coming era, right? We need to redefine that.
So just two quick questions is that, do you see this then becoming globalization minus US? Is that a possible fallout of this? And I'll come back to my second question. I just quickly lost my train of thought.
I don't think we'll see globalization minus US, but what we will see a reordering. We're already seeing mini-laterals come up. I think that if mini-laterals can somewhere repurpose themselves towards elements of trade, yes, that would be. So you'll see the US is still central to globalization, but you would also see certain new blocks of globalization. There's already talk of a CTPPP bloc plus EU. So there's already some of that happening.
Right. Yeah, so the second question I was going to ask is that do you see a ironic fallout of this could be that China begins to soften its sort of national identity a little bit to become more palatable to others in a political way?
I don't
Do you see any internal chatter like that?
No, in fact, I think what they've done is that there is a deep sense of Han nationalism. And the Chinese view of the world is encapsulated in this concept of the Global Civilization Initiative. Now, what they're essentially arguing is that we are a civilization. There are multiple civilizations across the world. Each of them have their own diverse characteristics. So we need to maintain that diversity as opposed to what the Americans said in the 1990s was universality. And we need to find a way to deal with each other. That does not tell me that the Chinese are looking to become far more multicultural, globalized. They want talent, skill, technology, but they don't necessarily want to fundamentally change, right? One of Xi Jinping's, this is the last point I'll make, one of Xi Jinping's core ideas is around cultural nationalism also, right? So I don't think that's going to change.
So if you were writing a memo that Julian Assange releases to the world, what would be your memo on this whole situation right now in like 3-4 lines, you know? Suppose you were writing a memo to the Indian government, the US government, and China. What would you be saying?
Of 3 very different things. I'd probably say to the Indian government that, there is an opportunity, but there is tremendous pain if you don't leverage that opportunity. 45% of India's GDP comes from trade. So closing of trade is not something that we need to be thrilled about. So we need to make sure that we take whatever changes are required to be able to make sure that trade remains open. To the US government, I'd say fight your battles internally as fast as possible. Resolve your battles. Stop undermining rule of law domestically, because that's your core strength. Because if you do that, there's no difference between the deal that you're offering and the Chinese are offering. So you're losing your comparative advantage. And to the Chinese, I'd say, be nicer to the rest of the world. It'll be good for you.
We haven't even touched on the EU, which has just been asleep on a lovely soft mattress, you know. So I think in many ways, Trump really may be the galvanizer that wakes up the entire European nation. But that is for another day. Thank you very, very much, Manoj, for that wonderful
Thank you so much.
Thank you.